Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to a new research seminar, of the series that we've been having jointly with the center. So I would like to start by thanking Heaven Crawley, who has accepted the invite to give us a presentation, share with us the HEED project, which I don't know too much about. So Heaven will tell us a little bit about the project and give us a presentation. So over to you, Heaven. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Masood, and thank you for organising the event and inviting me to come and speak. Let me just talk you through a little bit of the background to the project, because for those of you who don't know, this is actually a project that's run by the engineering department. The PI is Elena Gaura, as a team working in this case with us here in CTPSR. And really, it's the HEED stands for Humanitarian Engineering and Energy for Displacement. So yes, as I say, this is a project that is funded by the EPSRC under the GCRF program, which we won't talk about for the moment. But as you know, it's official development assistance. So the orientation is very much towards the kinds of research that can make a difference to the lives of people in the global south in the context of development. And this particular project was really around the use of energy to support the needs of displaced communities. In this case, I'm going to be talking today about our work in Rwanda, but the project also delivered in Nepal. And at the end, I'll give you the link to the website because there's lots of information about the project itself, but also about the data coming from the project that you can have a look at to find out more about the kind of the orientation of the work itself. I should also say that whilst I'm giving this presentation, and it's based on a paper by myself and a colleague, Thomas Sieboa, specifically that's been submitted to the International Journal of Humanitarian Action. It's always very strange, isn't it? Because there's so many people involved in this kind of research, and it feels wrong and odd to only have one or two people named. So I should say that in addition to Elena and the team at HEED, including Alison Halford and others, my colleague Chaz Morrison at CTPSR was involved in data collection. We worked with Practical Action in both contexts, and many of the researchers were from the community in the camps in which we were working. So just by way of an opening, I think it's really important to acknowledge that these things are never a solo enterprise, as sometimes comes across when you present in a seminar. So what I wanted to do in this presentation is it's a kind of small part, as I say, of a much bigger project, and I'm only going to be looking at one particular aspect of it, which in this case is the contributions of solar lighting in the context of camp in a refugee camp in Rwanda. But I wanted to look at this from, if you like, the social science perspective rather than the engineering perspective, although in this project they're intricately connected. In terms of what that engineering intervention in this case, what implications it has in a social context, because the social context within which we're doing our work is what's really important here. Because if we want to have an impact with the kinds of work that we do, whether that's engineering interventions or it's on the social sciences side, if it's health or education, we really need to understand the broader context within which those interventions take place. And the really important context of this project, of course, is the issue of access to energy in the context of protracted displacement. And by protracted displacement, what we mean is not just a kind of normal refugee situation, but rather a refugee situation where people have been displaced for a significant period of time and where their needs as refugees are not met, in part because a lot of refugee assistance in the humanitarian world is oriented towards immediate needs. So whether that's protection or whether that's providing housing and health and education, these movements are hoped to be short-term, and camp situations in particular are hoped to be short-term solutions, but in reality they often continue onwards for a very long time. And in this case, in the case of the populations in Rwanda that we're interested in, which was the Congolese population since the early 1990s. So we're looking at populations who've been displaced for decades, several generations, And we're also looking at a context where within the refugee world, there is increasing emphasis on supporting economic self-sufficiency, particularly, as I say, for those living in camps. From a policy point of view, this has been given more emphasis by some of the recent initiatives, including the Global Compact on Refugees and the Common Refugee Response Framework, of which Rwanda is a partner. But despite this, there are really significant problems in terms of access to energy. Because, as I say, lots of the basic needs, such as water and health and shelter, are often a priority for the agencies that are responsible for supporting refugees in the immediate period after the displacement. But there are no agencies that are really oriented towards those longer term aspects that would be necessary for self-sufficiency, including access to energy. And so the literature around this issue of energy is the one in which the HEAT project is embedded, and the one that is very much reflected in the website that I'll provide you for the link to at the end, because it's a context within which, you know, literally millions of people do not have access to the energy that they need to be able to survive on a day-to-day basis. In the Rwandan context, as I mentioned, the nature of the displacement has become very protracted. Rwanda is a very small country, one of the smallest countries in Africa, a population of around 12 million. It's a very fast-growing economy, or certainly was prior to, obviously, the COVID pandemic and everything that's done for economic growth everywhere, but had been sort of held up there as being an area, a country in which it was very fast growth, around 8%, but where there is extreme inequality, with a lot of people living in extreme poverty and a high dependence on foreign aid. Now, interestingly, from a kind of policy perspective, Rwanda has been celebrated in the international humanitarian sector for being very open to refugees, including those from the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, since '96, and others from Burundi as well, and elsewhere. At the beginning of 2020, which is more or less the latest figures we have, we know there were around 150,000 Congolese refugees and around the same proportion of refugees from Burundi. And most of those refugees, not all, but most, were living in camps, which is not typical, actually. In many countries, people don't live in camps, only around between 5 and 20%. But actually, in Rwanda, it's the opposite way around, with around 80% of refugees living in camps, in this case, in 6 different camps in different parts of the country. And as with all refugee populations, around half of that population is children. And so for those populations, you know, living there for 20, 25 years, this issue of the poverty of the general population and their own precarity as refugees with status within the country, but still within a very particular framework of protection, has very significant implications for their ability to be self-sufficient. Here's a map, as I say, of the different contexts within Rwanda, and we were working in the 2 camps to the north of Kigali, the capital, which is Nibaheki and Gihembe, and then in the south in Kigemi. So those are the 3 camps in which we're working, and the camp that I'm going to be talking about today is in Kigemi. No, it's not, sorry, it's in Gihembe, which is where we introduced the solar lighting through the streetlights. We did also have interventions in the other camps. Gihembe, we had the microgrid for the school and for the local population to use in other settings, but I'm focusing in this presentation on the work that we did in Gihembe with the solar lighting through streetlights, because one of the reasons why streetlights is so interesting in the context of energy is that it's something that we all take for granted. We can't even, in our privileged situations in which we live, conceive of a situation where we don't have access to light, because light is something that is so pivotal to how we organize our time, given that, you know, many activities take place potentially in hours of darkness. Now, this is not just an issue facing refugees, it's an issue facing populations across the global south in terms of access to light. The absence of light actually limits the possibilities for people in many different ways. And those are the aspects that I really want to talk about today. But I want to focus, as I say, on the streetlights, and I want to focus not on the intervention as a kind of process, an engineering solution, if you like, because there's other colleagues within the engineering department that are writing about that, and you'll find plenty of material on the HEED website that talks about that. But rather, I want to talk about the socioeconomic and broader consequences of lighting for the populations, because I think this is really important in terms of making the case why this kind of research can highlight not just, you know, the practicalities and logistics of how you might do this, but what the ripple effects of those interventions might be for the populations with whom you're working. So the first thing I want to talk about, which is slightly obvious, is how light changes the use of space. And I'm a geographer, so I feel inclined towards the use of space anyway, because I think it's a very interesting way of understanding how people live in different contexts. And I think the really important thing to note here, not surprisingly, is that prior to the introduction of the solar streetlights, and you can see an example here, this is actually one of the ones that has an integrated power socket for the charging of mobile phones and other devices. But prior to the introduction of these streetlights, the use of space in all the three camps where we were working was mainly restricted to daylight hours. And this obviously causes, and it's obvious but really significant, a restriction on movement, both inside and outside of the home. The best experience of that I have is if I go to somewhere in a rural area in the UK or somewhere in Europe, and I'm camping and I have a small light or I use my phone. This is the situation in which people are living on a day-to-day basis. So simple things like visiting the latrine, and bear in mind that these are not necessarily good quality facilities. We are talking here about contexts where there are ditches and difficult pathways or no pathways to get to the toilets, seeing friends, socializing, attending the health clinic or undertaking domestic chores, changing a baby's nappy, doing cooking. All of these things need light, and we take that for granted. And we know that the use of communal space, including latrines, is often highly gendered. And in the camp that we were working, we heard anecdotal evidence, for example, of organizations fitting lights to latrines, and then those latrines becoming communal spaces because they were the only places in the camp where there was light available, and inevitably men, for example, taking over those spaces as social areas, preventing women and children using the toilet facilities. So you can have these kind of gendered uses of space, but also gendered consequences of where lighting is introduced. So there's evidence that streetlights not only change the use of space within the camp, but also significantly increase feelings of security. So a quote there from a male refugee at Gahembe: "The big impact brought by the streetlight that are always on all night long is that all of us are able to see. When you leave home now, it's okay. Basically, it brought a big change to our lives. No one can harm you because there is light. It has changed our lives." So this is about the use of space, but it's also the security that people feel. And I think, again, in the quote in the top yellow box, in the dark, we are like blind people. The powerlessness that is associated with not being able to actually see where you are or what you're doing really shouldn't be underestimated. And it's a theme that follows through in our other research that was conducted in Gahembe, but also actually this is a picture in the backdrop from our work in Nepal, because we introduced streetlights to some of to the setting where we were working in Nepal too. And what was clear in both contexts was that the feelings of safety and security associated with the streetlights were again highly gendered. So particularly apparent among women and girls who not only were able to see around them, but could then, in theory, take cautions to protect themselves. And this really reinforces a very significant body of literature that draws attention to security concerns associated with a lack of light. Some of those security concerns are real, you know, gender and sexual violence, theft, fear of wild animals, robbery, vandalism. And some of them are perceived, because if you're scared about space and you're scared about those potential things happening to you, then actually you will use space in a way that reflects that, regardless of whether or not that space is actually real. I think it's really important recognize that lighting can, shine light on spaces where people would otherwise be hidden, and that it would deter perpetrators of various kinds. But it's also important to recognize that sexual and gender violence does not happen in a vacuum. It happens in a context of patriarchy. It happens in a context of poverty. And so you can't simply put in a streetlight and that resolves those problems of gender-based violence. There are gendered sociocultural structures and norms which enable violence to be perpetrated against women and girls. And I don't want to suggest for one moment that this in itself would solve those issues. But I think from our research, it clearly is a really important starting point that people feel able to use space and to be potentially protected within those spaces themselves or indeed by others. And that feeling of being safe follows through into other aspects of belonging, which I'll come on to. Before I do that, though, I just want to touch on the contribution of refugee self-reliance, because, as I mentioned at the beginning, this notion of refugee self-reliance has become increasingly important in the policy domain, but also reflected in some of the broader debates about refugeeness and what it means to be a refugee in a particular context. Displacement, of course, these aspects of being able to be self-reliant are very important. Now, the right to work for refugees is recognised in Rwanda as it is in international legal framework. But in practice in Rwanda, as elsewhere, there's a very significant gap between what is stated in government policies regarding refugees' inclusion and self-reliance and the realities in life on the other hand. And again, this needs to be situated or located within the context of poverty more generally in Rwanda. As soon as you go off the main roads in Rwanda, there is a lack of lighting, a lack of poverty and unemployment. And so what we're seeing in refugee camps is not specific or particular to refugee camps, but is nonetheless something which is a particular problem because of the issues around refugee integration and refugee self-reliance. We found when we undertook a survey of the 3 camps in which the HEAT project is working, that unemployment is a really significant feature of the camps. So around a third of the refugees who responded to the survey in Kagemi, Gihembe and Nibaheki said that they were either unemployed, laid off or looking for work. And frankly, most other people were, whilst they were employed, they were, if you like, underemployed in the sense that they were often scrabbling a living from very limited resources. So often as casual labourers, working within the camps as security guards, teachers, but mostly through self-employment. So the vast majority working for themselves, engaging in food and hot drink preparation, mobile money vending, charcoal and wood sales, sewing and hairdressing, as indeed in many other of the communities outside of the refugee camps themselves. So again, the provision of solar streetlights in this context clearly has the potential to increase refugees' economic participation because it stimulates nighttime economic activities. Before the lights were put in place, people told us essentially that they, as soon as it became dark, they had to close up their business and go back to their homes. Once they had the street lights, they were able to hold nighttime markets, to be able to be more productive, but also socialize in ways that generates other kinds of economic opportunities and a sense of self-reliance as much as an economic possibility. Of course, it also enables students to study, to revise after school. And we found that during the COVID-19 pandemic, university students who had to return from their studies were able to access the electricity that was provided through the microgrid that I mentioned at Gehemi for laptops. And they actually were studying in the school, the primary school that we were working with. Again, gendered impacts very clearly differences in what that lighting in the evening meant for people. Firstly, they were working more, which isn't necessarily per se a good thing unless you, of course, need the resources that accompany that. But we were generally finding that what nighttime light means is that women work longer and men play more, by which I mean that men have more opportunities for socialization, whereas women are engaging in extended household tasks or potentially working outside of the home in ways that may support their self-sufficiency, but nonetheless don't detract from the fact that they also have a full day looking after children and other household family members. So I think there's lots of things that are shown by the lighting, which also shine a light, frankly, on other aspects of gender relations and the division of labour within the camps and within society more generally, that again are not per se addressed by the provision of lights on their own. Just to finish, though, I wanted to talk about some senses of belonging that we found to be associated with the introduction of the lights that frankly none of us have anticipated at the outset of the project, and I think are not the kinds of things that are necessarily measurable in ways that get factored into thinking about what kind of development projects are worth investment of one kind or another. So I would say that none of us really thought when we set out on this project that lighting or even energy more generally would produce a sort of increased sense of belonging or improved social integration. But I think some of the most unexpected findings were in relation to these aspects. So the way in which light changed relationships within the camps. So, for example, very simple things, increased informal or social activities, for example, weddings, people cooking and eating together. This woman says people socialise more, especially in lights. They can eat together, have dinner together. And I remember very clearly on my first visit to Kigeme, actually, not Kihembe, but I remember when I went to Kigeme, people were talking about the fact that the refugees from the DRC do not like to socialise. They do not like to eat together. They do not like to sit outside. They like to have meals individually and to have their cook stoves in their homes, with, of course, consequence pollution within the household, for example. Now, we haven't done enough research to say this categorically. There may well be sociocultural reasons why refugees prefer to eat separately, for example. But we also know that the absence of lighting makes it impossible to do anything else. And so actually people are very keen to socialise sometimes and have dinner together. And these assumptions that it's a cultural element of the DRC community that they would want to eat separately may not in fact prove to be the case. It may actually be tied to the absence of alternatives. And so there's clearly a need for much more research to unpack these assumptions about what aspects are sociocultural and what aspects are related to the context in which people are living and the opportunities for doing things differently. This is more from Nibaheki, this next point, but we also provided solar panels for lighting in a community hall. And what we saw associated with that was an increase in formal community activities, including dancing classes, extracurricular teaching, and the meeting of leaders, so community activities and participation. And as importantly as that, there's increased sense of community pride and identity associated with the provision of solar lighting, which is not to say that there aren't issues around how you manage that community resource. And I know Elena in particular was very keen in this project to better understand how that kind of resource can be managed communally. And unfortunately, COVID came along at exactly the wrong time and made our research kind of curtailed in that dimension. But I think we, despite not really knowing, how that might be facilitated more effectively in the process, we do know that many of the people in the camps that we spoke with certainly identified with the community in ways that they hadn't done previously. And they often talked about seeing the camp illuminated at night and the sense of belonging and pride they had in relation to that. So we have a couple of quotes here on the security guard at Minimar, which is the government agency. I work at the entry gate, not like before when around 6 p.m. everyone was already at home and ready to go to sleep. Now there is light and the camp looks so beautiful. At night time, the camp looks like a normal town. This idea of normalization is very interesting and very important for a community that has felt displaced and not normal in the sense of being integrated historically. And you see it's completely different living with lights at night instead of being in the darkness the whole time. Since we've got the lights, there's basically no difference between the day and night. I'm telling you the truth, we don't feel any difference with the normal grid electricity. We are now developed. And so again, this idea of being developed, of being normal, is coming through in the ways in which people articulate this sense of social integration and a sense of belonging. So just by way of conclusion, and I realise I've covered a lot in a short amount of time, and as I say, there is lots more both on the Heat website and in the process of being produced in terms of the output. I think one of the things that's very important about access to lighting is that it can very profoundly alter the quality of life for refugees who are living in precarious environments, and perhaps more so than some of the other humanitarian interventions that are typically prioritized, which is not to say that food and water and housing and health is not important, but there is something very powerful potentially about having the opportunity to use those things, which sometimes is prevented by not being able to move around at night or see them. The restrictions to daylight hours can be very debilitating, not just in terms of the opportunities to work, but in terms of the sense of self-security, but also the sense of self in place. And what solar light does is it liberates, to a certain extent, bearing in mind the other constraints that are faced by the population, it sort of liberates them from a fear of the darkness and offers personal freedom to move around that hasn't previously existed, as well as stimulating nighttime economic and, of course, importantly, social activities. And I think this, as I said, this sense of belonging and seeing the place in which you live and seeing how others see it and therefore see you is really an important finding of the work that we hadn't anticipated. But, and it's a really big but, access to energy, as with all resources in the refugee context, is deeply political. And something like this, which is potentially very simple to put right, you know, we see huge pylons going over the camps, but yet people don't have access to electricity. We see main, you know, on-grid electricity being directed towards the UNHCR office, but not towards the population itself. This issue about whether you can get access to energy is deeply political. And the issue is not whether access to light has the potential to change the lives of refugees. We know it does, but rather whether there's the political will and indeed the policy mechanisms to make that happen in practice. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Heaven. I think we've come to the end of the seminar. So I will just say to everyone to watch the space, because there will be a seminar, another seminar, the next one about heat, where Elena Gora, who is the PI actually of the heat project, will be talking about probably the engineering aspects of the project with another speaker. So thank you very much, Heaven, and thank you everyone for contributing with your questions and discussions.
But thank you for the opportunity, and thanks for the
thank you.
Thanks for the really excellent questions and comments. Appreciate it.
Thank you.